January 1942. When 3 million American GIs flooded into wartime Britain, they didn't just bring weapons and supplies, they brought charm, chocolate, and promises that would forever change 60,000 British women's lives. While bombs fell during the Blitz and husbands fought overseas, these women found themselves pregnant with American babies, creating the war's most scandalous secret that governments on both sides desperately tried to hide. But what happened to the thousands of children whose American fathers simply vanished when the war ended? And why did it take 80 years for their heartbreaking stories to finally surface? January 1942 brought the sound of heavy boots on cobblestone streets across Britain. American soldiers stepped off ships at Liverpool and Southampton, their uniforms crisp and their voices loud in the foggy morning air. They carried duffel bags over their shoulders and chewed gum with confident smiles. The locals watched from behind blackout curtains as trucks rolled through villages that had known only quiet for generations. Britain was a country under siege. Every window was taped with brown paper strips to stop glass from flying during bomb blasts. Street lights stayed dark at night to hide the cities from German planes overhead. Families ate the same small portions each day because food was rationed. A pound of sugar lasted a month. Meat appeared on tables maybe twice a week. Children had forgotten the taste of oranges and chocolate. The women of Britain worked in factories making bullets and bombs. Their hands were stained black from gunpowder, and their backs ached from 12-hour shifts. At night, they went home to empty houses because their husbands were fighting in France or North Africa. Letters came once a month if they were lucky. Many women had not seen their men in over a year. Into this gray world came 3 million Americans. They walked differently than British men. Their shoulders were straighter, and their laughs were louder. They had money in their pockets, and stories of a place across the ocean where lights stayed on at night, and stores were full of everything a person could want. The British called them overpaid, oversexed, and over here. But they said it with curious eyes. The first meeting places were church halls turned into dance floors. Red Cross volunteers organized social evenings where British women could meet the American soldiers. The women wore their best dresses, the ones saved for special occasions. They had mended the tears and let out the seams to make them fit after months of small meals. Their lipstick was precious, saved in tiny tubes and applied carefully. The Americans brought gifts that seemed like magic. Real chocolate that melted smooth on the tongue, silk stockings that made legs look perfect, cigarettes in full packs instead of the half-empty ones rationed by the government. They spoke of places called California and Texas, where the sun always shined, and no one worried about bombs falling from the sky. But something else was happening in these dance halls and movie theaters and quiet walks through bombed-out parks. Something that would create secrets too dangerous to speak out loud. Something that would change the lives of 60,000 women in ways they never expected. The Americans had brought more than chocolate and stockings to Britain. They had brought promises that would test everything these women believed about love, duty, and the price of happiness in wartime. The Americans kept their promises in ways that made British hearts skip beats. Mary Jenkins watched wide-eyed as her new boyfriend Joe pulled a whole chocolate bar from his pocket, not the tiny squares she remembered from before the war. He broke off piece after piece and placed them on her tongue like communion wafers. The sweetness was so rich she almost cried. At the Red Cross dances, the Americans brought music that made feet move in new ways. They played records shipped from places called Memphis and New York. The women learned to swing dance, their skirts spinning in circles they had not spun since childhood. The men taught them to jive, lifting them off the ground with strong arms that smelled of aftershave instead of factory oil. But the real magic happened in quiet moments. Susan Thompson sat in Hyde Park with Private Bobby from Kansas, sharing a meal he had packed from the American mess hall. White bread so soft it felt like clouds. Real butter thick as paint. Meat that covered the whole sandwich instead of thin slices you could see through. She ate slowly, making each bite last, while he told stories of farms where corn grew taller than houses and cattle grazed on grass that stretched to the horizon. The Americans had access to things that seemed impossible. They drove trucks loaded with supplies to places British women had never imagined. Coca-Cola bottles clinked in wooden crates, the dark liquid fizzing with a sweetness that made tongues tingle. Ice cream arrived in metal containers, cold enough to make teeth ache with pleasure. Coffee beans filled the air with smells that made the thin tea of rationing seem like colored water. In the factories where women worked beside American mechanics, the contrasts grew sharper. The Americans fixed machines with tools that looked brand new. They had spare parts for everything, while British workers made do with bent nails and twisted wire. When lunchtime came, the Americans opened metal boxes filled with food that looked like pictures from magazines. The British women ate bread and margarine and watched their new friends bite into apples so red they looked painted. Romance bloomed in bomb shelters during air raids, where whispered conversations lasted through long nights underground. American voices spoke of homes with electricity that never failed, and cars in every driveway. They described supermarkets with shelves full of everything a family could need. They painted pictures of a world where no one worried about having enough food or fuel or hope. The women began to believe these stories because the evidence sat right in front of them. These men had come from a place of plenty. And they were sharing that plenty one chocolate bar, one dance, one gentle kiss at a time. But with each gift and each promise, invisible threads were being woven that would soon become chains neither side fully understood. The morning sickness started in March 1943, 3 months after the Christmas dances that had felt like fairy tales. Margaret Powell bent over the factory sink, her stomach twisting as the smell of metal polish hit her nose. She had missed her monthly bleeding twice now, but she told herself it was the stress of war. Women's bodies did strange things when bombs fell every night and food was scarce. But deep down, she knew the truth that was growing inside her belly, the truth that would change everything. In bedrooms across Britain, women stared at themselves in cracked mirrors, turning sideways to see if their dresses were getting tight. They counted days on calendars, hoping their math was wrong. They touched their stomachs with trembling fingers and wondered how they would explain this to mothers and fathers who still believed their daughters were good girls who followed the rules. The realization hit different women at different moments, but it always hit like a punch to the chest. For some, it was the taste of morning tea that suddenly made them sick. For others, it was the feeling of their brassiere getting too small, or the need to sleep more hours than the day contained. Betty Morrison knew for certain when she fainted during her shift at the munitions factory, falling right onto the concrete floor in front of 50 other women who whispered behind their hands. The Americans reacted in ways that revealed who they really were beneath their charming smiles. Some men, like Joe Martinez, held their girlfriends tight and promised marriage before the baby came. They talked about big weddings and boat trips to America, where the women would live in houses with white picket fences. These men meant every word they said, their eyes bright with the idea of starting families in the land of plenty. But other men disappeared like smoke when the news came. They suddenly had new assignments that took them to different bases. They stopped showing up at the Red Cross dances. Their letters stopped coming. leaving women to read the same old promises over and over until the paper fell apart in their hands. Private Tommy from Ohio told Sarah Hughes he loved her on Tuesday night, then transferred to a base in Scotland on Wednesday morning without saying goodbye. The women who found themselves alone faced choices that felt impossible. Marriage to an American meant leaving everything they had ever known. It meant crossing an ocean to live with strangers in a place they had only heard about in stories. But having a baby without a husband meant shame that would follow them for the rest of their lives. Their families would whisper. Their neighbors would point. Their children would grow up with questions they could not answer. The racial tensions made everything more complicated for women who had fallen in love with Black American soldiers. Dorothy Williams held her boyfriend James tight in the shadows behind the dance hall, knowing that her parents would never accept him, and his family in Alabama might never accept her. The baby growing inside her would have skin darker than hers in a country where such children faced hatred from both sides of the color line. She loved James with her whole heart, but love alone could not change the world they lived in. Some women made desperate trips to back alley rooms where old women with dirty hands promised to solve their problems for a few pounds. Others tried remedies their grandmothers whispered about, drinking bitter teas and taking scalding baths, hoping their bodies would give up the pregnancies that threatened to destroy their reputations. The lucky ones found doctors who would help quietly, but most faced their situations with only prayer and hope. The war itself became a strange backdrop to these personal battles. While newspapers talked about victories in North Africa and bombing raids over Germany, women worried about morning sickness during air raid sirens. They wondered how to tell their parents about American babies, while their brothers fought American allies on foreign battlefields. The big history everyone would remember was happening at the same time as the small histories that would change individual lives forever. The moment of truth came differently for each woman, but it always came with the same question echoing in their minds. What happens to love when war ends and the soldiers go home? The ships sailed away in August 1945, carrying 3 million American soldiers back across the Atlantic Ocean. From the docks of Liverpool and Southampton, women watched the gray vessels disappear into the morning fog. Some held babies in their arms, children with American fathers who had kept their promises of marriage. Others stood alone, their hands empty, but their hearts full of memories that would last lifetimes. The lucky ones had papers in their purses. The War Brides Act let 60,000 British women follow their husbands to America, but the process took months of waiting and forms and medical checks. They packed their lives into single suitcases, leaving behind parents who might never see them again and friends who had shared bomb shelters and factory shifts. The boats that carried them west were crowded with crying babies and nervous mothers who wondered if their new homes would match the stories their husbands had told. But thousands of other women faced different futures. They returned to houses that felt too quiet after years of American laughter. They went back to jobs in factories that now made peacetime goods instead of bullets and bombs. Their children grew up asking questions about fathers, with names like Johnny and Bobby and Frank, men who had vanished like characters from fairy tales that ended too soon. The hardest struggles belonged to the mothers of mixed-race children, the brown babies whose skin told stories their neighbors did not want to hear. In small English towns where everyone knew everyone else's business, these women faced stares and whispers that followed them to shops and schools and churches. Their children learned to fight with their fists before they learned to write their names, defending mothers who had loved across color lines in a world not ready for such love. Some fathers did try to keep in touch. sending letters with American stamps and photographs of houses with big yards and cars in driveways. They sent money when they could, and promises to bring their families to America when immigration laws changed. But distance and time and new lives made these connections fade, like old photographs left in sunlight. The children who grew up with these stories learned hard lessons about love and loss, and the price of dreaming too big during wartime. They carried their fathers' names, but not their presence. They inherited American features in British faces, creating questions they would spend lifetimes trying to answer. Some searched for their fathers decades later, using letters and photographs as treasure maps to find men who had moved on to new wives and new children, who knew nothing of their wartime romances. The real legacy of these 60,000 women was not just the children they raised or the oceans they crossed. It was the proof that love happens even in the darkest times, that human hearts find ways to hope even when bombs fall and futures seem impossible. They learned that some promises are kept and others are broken, but the courage to love is always worth the risk.